Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Sword Art Online video. This is going to be my review for Sword Art Online Progressive Movie 2, Scherzo of a Deep Night. So this, for anyone who's unaware, I suppose, of this, the second progressive movie basically covers the events of Floor 5. So the first movie covered Floor 1. In the movies, we skip ahead and cover Floor 5 here, which is actually the events of Progressive Volume number 4, which is this book here. So you may be asking the question, what about Floor 2, 3, and 4? What about the other volumes in between? Well, that's the really interesting thing here from an adaptation point of view, is that the first movie of the book, the first movie covers basically the first half of this book. Not even the first half. Where's the break point here? Yeah, here. So this book is actually split up into, this section of the book here is movie 1. It's Floor 1. This section of the book is Floor 2. You get Aria of a Starless Night and Floor 2, Rondo for a Fragile Blade. So they've skipped the events of Floor 2, the events of Floor 3, and the events of Floor 4 in volume 2 and 3 as well, and moved on to this. Now, the reasoning that was given, as far as I'm aware, the only thing I've seen is that Reiki Kawahara, when the first movie came out and then they announced the second one, he said the reasoning behind jumping ahead to Floor 5 and skipping the other stuff was that those books cover the Elf War quest line within the game. And because that is not complete as of where he was writing Progressive at the time, they didn't think it was right to do a movie about it. Now, that's deeply questionable logic, because by that very same logic, well, that means you're the reason it's not complete, but then the movie would be about the first stage of it, which is complete. So why does the start inherently depend on the end when you've already written it? So are you that lacking in confidence of your own material that you feel like you would need to change it? To me, the main reasoning behind why they did this is because the events of Volume 4 is probably the most movie-esque or significant of the volumes of Progressive, in that Rondo for a Fragile Blade is a very kind of game mechanics, technically focused floor and plot. While there's some very cool stuff throughout Volume 2 and 3, as you go through the Elf War quest line and some of the stuff that happens there, I don't necessarily think they would work as movies in terms of a really big bombastic sense. Sword Art Online fans would go to see it, but I get, perhaps from a marketing perspective, they viewed Floor 5, the first milestone floor for the players, as being the kind of big one to kind of focus on. Now, it's obviously ignoring a lot of kind of fan demand, because, for instance, one of the fan favorite characters from Progressive, Kismel, who is a kind of NPC, she is a huge fan favorite character, and so they've just kind of ignored her entire plot in doing what they've done here. And so straight away, for me, as someone who has read the light novels, and a large appeal with this movie is to see this text-based story where you only have a couple of images throughout it, because it's mostly a novel, to see that finally get put into animation. So the idea of it being basically a scene-for-scene, shot-for-shot, direct, accurate adaptation is, I think, a perfectly fine thing to ask for. So this is where you have to go back to the first movie and realize, well, they didn't exactly do that. It was mostly good, but the big thing was the introduction of the new main character, Mito, which changed quite a bit about the way the first movie kind of worked and played out. Now, logically, you get why they did that in the first movie. It was more from Asana's perspective, so they felt they should give Asuna more of a character, like a character to interact with before she meets Kirito, so that she has an arc that exists just beyond that. The problem was that I think Mito probably ends up coming out a little bit being too close to Kirito, and my issue with that first movie was mainly just that Asuna goes from basically like she's friends with the second best beta tester in the game to being friends with the best beta tester in the game. And sure, that early stuff really, really worked, but then it kind of got into quite heavy retcon material with how they incorporated Mito into things. For the most part, like, it wasn't like terribly bad, but this is something that Sword Art Online has dealt with for quite a while because of the way it started, where basically the entire plot of Aincrad was told within the first 2 volumes, covering basically none of the floors. Everything has had to be like filling in the gaps. And so the whole idea of progressive is showing the progress through the floors and basically not really skipping anything from the main character's kind of point of view. So the movie's basically making the decision to skip over entire floors worth of content when the content is right there is really, really annoying. And then the stuff that they do decide to adapt, they're retconning even further by introducing this new character. And in that sense, like, I get anyone who's frustrated with it because I'm frustrated with it myself. That the whole point of progressive is that it's meant to be the kind of, in a way, ideal version of the story, and now already it's out of date. Like, he's still in the middle of writing progressive. It's only up to volume 8, floor 7, because he started to do 2 volumes per floor rather than a floor per volume. So it's getting a little bit kind of out of hand here about like what the plan is. Like, I don't have a clue what the next animation project for Sword Art Online is. I don't know if it's been announced. Like, is it going to be another progressive thing? Is it something else? I don't even know. But we're in a weird spot with Sword Art Online at the moment, where there's Moon Cradle from the post-Alicization stuff to still be adapted into an anime, but most people would say that feels somewhat incomplete and could do with some more volumes, which he hasn't written yet. Unital Ring, which is the ongoing arc at the moment, even though it has quite a few volumes, it's, in a way, like, it still is unraveling what the plot actually is, so it feels like it's still too early to do that yet. Which, for the most part, leaves the remaining progressive material to adapt, but I don't think a lot of what's left is kind of worth doing a movie about. So you'd want an anime series, but that's going to be awkward because you're going to have to theoretically start with floor 2 and do a lot of explaining about why you're skipping certain floors because movies have happened in between. But that's probably the best way to do it, is to do like an anime season covering floor 2, 3, 4, skip over 5, go on to floor 6, go on to floor 7. And because that is effectively like, what, 6.5 books, that would probably be enough to do like an entire season's worth of content. But I don't know what the plan is. So, that preamble out of the way about the fact that, I think continuity is important, and there's a lot of confusion around Sword Art Online. Let's get into my thoughts on the movie. Overall, as a Sword Art Online fan, I enjoyed this. Seeing a Sword Art Online movie on the big screen for now the 3rd time still had the same impact that it did the first time. It's just a really cool experience. Big screen, the music, the way the animation looks. It's a really cool experience. I saw it in dub, for anyone wondering. One of the few showings in Ireland for the movie. And in that sense, it's just like, there's that inherent, I'm a fan of this franchise, so a big movie for this franchise is something I'm going to like. I'm inclined to like. But because I do follow Sword Art Online quite closely and read the novels, there is that other sense from the continuity perspective, the way they chose to do the adaptation, where some problems come in. If I could completely separate this out on its own, and there was no confusion over like what is the actual like correct version of the story, there's a lot to like here, and I think for the most part there's not too many like issues with what happens in this movie. I think you can tell that you know the floor is not. They had to work at this, I think, to make this kind of work as a movie. It doesn't have the same impact that the Floor 1 story has, even though it's the big, Floor 5 boss. And that's where maybe some of that frustration of them skipping over the other movies comes into play, is that early on, the movie does have a lot of explaining to do, to explain, and effectively, here's how the player base kind of has grown in and evolved into post Floor 1, now that we're actually making progress. Here's effectively how we land at the status quo on Floor 5. And so they have to do this whole big thing at the start, explaining, this is the Dragon Knights Brigade, this is the Aincrad Liberation Squad, this is Cabao, you remember Cabao, this is him. This is Lind, here is his connection to Diavel, that's this guild. They are at odds with each other because of their different philosophies about how to basically advance the game, the correct way to do it, and they're setting up this kind of guild conflict while also at the same time doing the early setup for Laughing Coffin beginning to try and influence the player base into player killing, which is an extremely questionable thing to do when it is a game of death, because we're back in early SAO when that was the case. So all of that stuff is like, it's cool, but it requires it to have the explanation that basically naturally happens as you go from Floor 2, 3, 4, and then into 5. So you get this stuff naturally in the other ones, where you see the guilds in Floor 2, 3, Kirito and Asuna have interactions with them as you get to this point. But instead, in animation, we haven't seen that stuff, apart from a little bit of the Floor 1 stuff, which was when the group was still united under Diaval, and we never really properly truly saw the separation of the two groups into forming these guilds. And they do a good job at explaining it. For anyone who's completely unaware of the situation, here is a pretty good explanation. But it is an explanation that is so badly needed, because if they didn't, you'd have no clue what happens. And this gets into, how does the movie reference very clear stuff that they have to reference from the previous volumes. So for instance, you have that really important scene that basically is the gimmick of Floor 5, the relics, which leads them underground into the catacombs. Asuna gets separated from Kirito and then encounters basically a Laughing Coffin kind of like meetup between two characters. And Kirito is the one to kind of, in a way, save the situation. Asuna does stuff on her own as well to get out of it, but Kirito arriving really calms down the situation. And you have to acknowledge in this scene that Kirito and Morte have had a really, really important encounter on, I think, Floor 3. And they do say they had this encounter on Floor 3. But if you haven't read the novel, you have no idea what that encounter is, the magnitude of it, or how intense that situation was, which is that they had this duel. And I believe it was either, what was it? It wasn't a first strike duel. It was something like, almost like a half health duel or something like that. And it was this weird situation where Kirito realized during the duel that what Morte was trying to do was to almost like chip Kirito down to like 51 health before the duel ends, and then deliver a devastating blow from 51 health to kill Kirito in the middle of technically a non-kill duel. And Kirito counters with his like big upgraded sword, I think it is, and it reverses the situation and nearly kills Morte. And it's this crazy situation where, this is Kirito investigating the player killer stuff. And it's here, and they reference it enough to get it across very well. But it's, again, how much more intense and interesting would this scene be if you had seen that scene in animation in a previous movie? Instead, it is just a reference of hey, yeah, you guys don't get to see the other floors animated, or anything like that. The biggest change, you would say, from the light novel to the movie is definitely that a large part of the early section of the book focuses on basically kind of the aftermath of Floor 4. So this movie does show you the floor 4 boss fight, but again, the details are different. In the light novel, they actually have, I think it's Kismel, and then what's his name, Yonfis, who's like the elf general on floor 4. They get the 2 NPCs to actually help them in the boss battle, and it makes the floor 4 boss fight surprisingly easy. So it's very quickly covered in the light novel, but it is that they do get the help of the elf NPCs. And in this one, in the movie, they're not there. They more established that they were having the fight, and then Argo basically solves the kind of mystery kind of change from the beta thing, which is that the room gets flooded. In the novel, I think when they just opened the boss floor in general, the room was flooded already, and there's that. So, that's kind of one thing. So it's an interesting one about how, like, you understand some of these things, but you don't understand others, because, like, at the start, they discussed the idea that, going into this volume 4, that Kirito and Asuna have to go back to the castle on floor 4 with the elves to claim their reward from doing that part of the Elf War campaign. They just ignore that completely here. Even though I think we have like 2 or 3 scenes in this book where we go back to floor 4 and we deal with some of the kind of elf stuff. And I think we even deal with some elf stuff on this floor. Though even in the book, Kismel is not in the book on floor 5. She's already, I think, moved on to the next floor. But we still get Elf War stuff. That is completely removed out of this. They don't reference any of the Elf War campaign stuff whatsoever. And it's weird to me because it makes it feel like they don't want to focus on a story where the plot is not about the players interacting with other players. That they almost view a plot where it's more about the game mechanics or the actual quests that are in Sword Art Online, the game, are not interesting enough to justify doing a movie about. And like I said, this is despite Kismel being like a fan favorite character, and like Asuna ends up having a really strong relationship with her because, again, even with Kismel, they are doing sort of like early setup on the whole idea of SAO is kind of changing things, and there's a sense that the AIs in this game are more realistic, or there's something different about some of them than you would typically expect, which is a setup, obviously, to the whole kind of like UE situation, which is ultimately a very early setup for the Allyization arc. So there's that stuff as well, because there's almost like an implication almost within the story that, like, does something happen to Kismel, and this affects how Asuna views NPCs, which might inform that moment I forget which anime episode it was, but it's when they separate and then Kirito meets her again, and she's just proposing, lead the enemies to attack NPCs, don't care what they're about, and Kirito disagrees with that. And obviously that scene, it feels weird given how Asuna feels about NPCs so far in the game, so something must have to happen to get her to that point, and they don't really touch on that stuff at all. Then that gets us into some of the other characters who are of focus on this floor. So Argo is who they're kind of highlighting as being sort of like the main event of this movie, that you didn't really get Argo in the first movie apart from a teaser right at the end. You got Mito instead, and I think most people didn't like that change. They didn't like that Mito being in the movie seemingly meant that Argo couldn't be in the movie. Here we get Argo and Mito. Now, ultimately, Argo's role in this is, I think, pretty nicely done. As effectively an introduction in the anime for this character, I think they did a pretty good job. Now, again, I think I prefer it in the light novels because you get gradual encounters with Argo as you go through the volumes, rather than just one kind of big kind of sequence, one story where Argo becomes a focus. Now, this is obviously significant because they're going to need to introduce the character of Argo to anime fans ahead of we assume the eventual adaptation of Unital Ring, where Argo becomes an important character both in the game as well as out of the game. And so, this was something that was greatly needed ultimately. And I think they do Argo really well. I like the decisions they made with sort of like the voice acting for the character. Her relationship with both Asuna and Kirito was kind of good, because you get the whole dynamic that with Kirito, she plays around with him. She's always trying to kind of make fun of him a little bit, but always is kind of like, you always have to pay me for information. But with Asuna, she's much nicer and is kind of like, I'll give you this one for free. Now, admittedly, there is a point towards the end where she does say, Kirito, oh, you don't have to pay me for this one, because it's information important to the boss battle. And, you get an interesting emotional kind of point here about highlighting why does she do so much for the player base here. Why does she put herself at risk on her own a lot of the time to gather this information? And she, this is what she feels is her duty as a beta tester. This is how she avoids getting the kind of beta tester kind of like hatred drawn towards her, is because she is the beta tester most known for, here's everything I know. And so you can't really particularly hate her for that. Whereas, of course, we still have the situation where the player base still knows Kirito as the beater, which is what basically deflects away from hatred of other beta testers, which ultimately helps characters like, say, Mito able to go about their business without being, hassled or hated because they are a beta tester, because Kirito exists to draw that hatred away. So the Argo stuff I really liked. I still don't understand why they didn't just have her scenes in Volume 1, because some of them are so memorable, but they did what they did. I like the way it ended up turning out. Then we get into Shivata and Litten, or Liten, whichever way you want to pronounce it. But these two characters are in the movie. They get some focus, but I wouldn't say they get the focus that the book gives them. Mainly from the perspective of, yes, visually they show that the two are a couple, but they never really have like the interactions from the book that you expect, which is like Kirito and Asuna kind of figuring out like, oh yeah, those two are a couple, aren't they? And them almost like teasing Asuna and Kirito about, you two are a couple as well, aren't you? So there's less of that. The other point would be Litten and her basically backstory within the game. Because I think they roughly allude to some of this, the idea that like she was in the Town of Beginnings up until relatively recently, but they don't explain the full situation, which is effectively that she actually found a glitch in the game where an iron ore vein was unlimited for a certain amount of time. So she was able to mine out enough materials to make an entire set of iron armor, way ahead of the sort of scaling within the game when any player would typically be able to do that. So Litten is actually, just from an equipment point of view, like the best equipped tank in the entire game. Now, I think her player character level is slightly lower than, for instance, say Shivata, who's also a tank but has like lower level equipment, but she still is incredibly strong as a tank just because of the equipment that she has. And and that was just like a nice little backstory that didn't add too much else, that just made the characters something more. Instead, what they did here was they sort of altered a scene here where, I believe in the book, the way it happens is that the whole, let's form this ragtag small group to raid the boss battle before either of the guilds do, so the guilds don't kill each other over the boss drop. And what happens is that they get Shivata and Litten, who like Asuna and Kirito are friendly with, to join them, even though they're from the opposing guilds. What they ask is like, okay, bring one other member of your guild with you, so just we have a few more players. And that's where you get Hafner included, as well as what's the other character's name? Okotan, I think it is. Not particularly important as a character, but so you have 2 DKB and 2 ALS characters on the raid. And I think the idea is more that in the book, this is all completely done behind the guild leaders' backs. Neither of them know. Whereas in the movie, Kibao is there in the scene where they discuss this. and they just bring it up in front of him completely. And Kirito is able to convince Kibao that this is the right thing to do. But because of the sort of surly character that he is, he can't bring himself to just be reasonable. And so he just sort of walks out and is just kind of like, okay, I'll go along with this, but I can't be seen to really agree with this. So, please don't pay any attention to the fact that the full raid team is going to meet up at like 6 on this day. And so he gives them the information of just like, go raid before this time, and that's how you'll make this happen. Just highlighting that Kibao is more reasonable than you would perhaps initially think, which I thought was decent characterization. That scene, I didn't mind that change too much, even though it's actually a somewhat notable change in the grand scheme of the actual plot. So that one worked out quite well, especially because you had to, I think, create that distinction between Kibao and then what Joe, who's basically an early Laughing Coffin member, but they don't quite know it yet, him being one to really highlight that, no, Kirito's a beater, like we can't agree with this plan he's come up with, trying to, again, incite the players to kill each other, because again, that is the plot of this movie when it really breaks down, is that the early Laughing Coffin members are trying to use this floor 5 boss drop, which is the guild flag, which would drastically change the power level of whichever guild gets it, because it just buffs everyone in your guild when you put the flag down. So it would effectively mean that one guild just wins over the other guild, and the other guild doesn't have a chance. So to avoid destroying basically half of the frontline assault force, Kirito comes up with this plan where ragtag group of more or less unaligned players, guilds who are just smaller, they're going to take the boss out. They'll claim the item, and then Kirito comes up with the plan, which is basically that I'll hold on to this, but if another guild flag drops, I will immediately give the guild flag I have to the team that doesn't have one. That way there is balance between the top two guilds. Or he gives them the other option, which is that if you basically right now, or at some point in the future, decide that your two guilds want to actually form a new guild and become one, I'll just hand it over straight away. No charge whatsoever. And so the idea is that that second option, in an ideal world, would be what happens. It's what a lot of the players do want, but more or less effectively because of the rivalry between Kibao and Lind, it isn't going to happen. But the other option of just like whenever one team gets one, the other team will automatically have one because Kirito has a guild flag is also very much, makes sense and is pretty fair. And again, this is where they do like allude to some stuff. Like when Kirito and Mito kind of finally have their meeting and talk, we get sort of like Kirito's kind of plan for Asuna. Now, this is where not having the Kirito Asuna specific scenes from like floor 2, 3, 4 comes into play a little bit, and so you're missing some of the development here. But the idea is that Kirito is going to hang around with Asuna, train her, because he sees so much potential in her. He thinks that she can basically do what he can't do, which is she's liked by the player base. She's invited to things like these parties while he isn't, because her reputation isn't like soiled by what happened from before, whereas Kirito is just always remembered as like the solo beater, and so doesn't get it in that case. And so even though I think everyone knows that if Kirito formed like a guild and was the guild leader, it would be the best guild in the game, there are just players who don't really like him because of the way he like approaches the game and everything that's happened. But Kirito sees the idea that in the future, Asuna is going to be able to be someone who can draw people to a guild and can basically almost like unite the player base and be a really, really strong leader high up in a guild. And that's what he's kind of there for. That's why he's protecting her. It's because, yes, he cares about her, but also for the sake of the game and all that stuff, he sees her as being essential to completing the game. That she can be one of those key leaders in the assault force, which she's already sort of like growing to be, but she's still somewhat inexperienced at floor 5. And that's kind of the setup for she eventually becomes second in command of the Knights of the Blood Oath type thing. Which, given that Kayaba is actually the leader, technically makes her the actual kind of player leader, kind of quote unquote, of the guild. So she fulfills that role. So that's a very kind of significant point here. And, they address that throughout the movie. That is kind of one of the plots. Like, Argo kind of tells kind of Asuna that, she's kind of worried about, ooh, what if he, kind of leaves me and goes off on his own and stuff like that. He's a solo player. He keeps saying that. And she kind of just notes that, the reason, he doesn't go off and do solo stuff is because he kind of doesn't need to anymore. And the reason, it's the secret, is because he's got you. He isn't the solo player anymore because of you. And she kind of remembers that. So that's pretty significant. The next, I suppose, character we need to talk about is a character who's not even included in this movie. And that is Nezha. He is the, fragile blade. Rondo for a fragile blade. This is all from floor 2. So all the way back in volume 1 of Progressive. It's the other half of volume 1 of Progressive. We get floor 2 as well. It's all about this character Nezha, who is this blacksmith, and it's all about this kind of upgrade scam. There he is, Nezha. This upgrade scam that happens, and this other guild that has really high level equipment, despite not being particularly great players, that gets resolved at the end of floor 2. Nezha is brought back into things ahead of the floor 5 boss battle in the light novel, because he has a specific weapon called a chakram, which is one of the few good ranged weapons in the entire game at this point. So in the books, Nezha is brought back in to be the sort of ranged fighter to take out the Vacant Colossus's kind of weak spot. Whereas in the movie, they give that spot to Mito because her scythe can kind of extend with chains to be sort of a quite long ranged weapon. This is probably one of the more kind of forced retcon changes, I think, in the game, because the setup, of course, is that Asuna goes to Mito to speak to her for the first time since floor 1, to ask her to join this boss raid because they need high-powered players who aren't part of the big 2 guilds to join. So she goes to her. And she doesn't agree, she doesn't want to. Asuna challenges her to a duel to try and make her agree to it. Really strong duel, but of course Mito does in the end win. But even though she sees Asuna's strength and that Asuna can protect herself now, she still disagrees. And it's really only Kirito later showing up and being like, "Hey, yeah, I heard the whole thing," and getting across the idea of this is the potential I see in Asuna. She needs to be protected. I'm going to protect her. And I think what she needs is everyone who's close to her to protect her. And that includes you. Basically kind of saying that, look, what happened on floor 1 happened. You did what you did. But you can still choose to protect her again now at a key moment. And so Mito initially isn't there at the boss raid, but is there to sort of help and protect Asuna during a key moment in the boss battle. Now again, this is where they again change a moment. This is actually a Shivata moment, I believe, in the... this is a Shivata Litten moment, actually, in the book, where Shivata gets caught by one of the arms and is being crushed. His armor actually gets broken. But then Litten sort of dives in to sort of keep it from closing, which allows the players to free them both from the arm. And then Shivata actually reveals that because he's one of the higher level players, he's kind of almost second in command of his guild. He has a second set of armor that he can just immediately put on and get back to fighting again. And it's a good scene for both Shivata and Litten. And they give that to Asuna and Mito here, which I felt was a little kind of forced, because again, the whole point of those characters being here is to do stuff like this and to really highlight them as being a relationship between 2 players cross guild. So, there was that. But, that scene kind of worked. The bigger problem, I think, is okay, Nezha does make sense. It makes sense that they would address and use characters who were introduced in previous volumes. But they didn't. And the other thing as well with the Lytton stuff, while I'm thinking about it, is that she does reveal that, okay, she gets the ore from the infinite ore thing in the novels, but she says that who forged the armor for her was a female blacksmith who was kind of like up and coming, trying to make a name for herself. And the image in the book that you get is clearly an early setup for Lisbeth. That it's meant to be her, and the idea of just like, oh, can you introduce me to her, as like basically Asuna's kind of perspective. So they don't do that setup kind of here either, because they don't do the full story with Lytton. I don't hate or like really, I'm not upset about the Neza inclusion not being here, because I don't think he's like a super amazing character. But again, it is an example of a change being made. And literally, in this case, a role in the raid being given to a completely separate character. And what they, in a way, kind of like didn't quite do in the first movie, they did here. And that is just give Mito the scenes that technically belong to other characters. Which is the main frustration that I think people have with her. Because I think most people like the characterization, like the idea of Asuna having a friend, someone else she knows within the game. And there is emotion surrounding like what happened in the first movie, and they're kind of meeting up again in this movie. And the regret that Mito has, and what she's trying to do with herself in the game, because they reveal she wasn't involved in the floor 2, 3, or 4 boss battle. She was involved in the floor 1 and now the floor 5 boss battle. So what's she doing? And they reveal that she's upgraded like her item crafting experience, and she gives Asuna an item that kind of comes into play a little bit, and that's all like, cool. So they're almost setting up that like, oh, so it's sort of maybe like later in the game Mito just going to be sort of more of a someone who runs like an item shop type thing, because clearly I think the implication with Mito is that at some point she dies in the game. Because I think the most difficult retcon in all of this is, if she survives SAO, how don't we know about her already, given how many characters from SAO have met up in real life at this point? If Asuna and Mito were super close friends, there's no way we wouldn't have known about her from before. And that's a very, very difficult retcon to do. So Mito at some point you assume will have to die, and it's a matter of like when that actually is. I think so. We'll see how that plays out. The laugh and cough and stuff, like I said, is just them trying to put a rift within the player base, because the other part here is that the New Year's celebration is coming up, so a party has been planned for both guilds. But the whole point of like the boss thing is that the Laughing Coffin members are basically advising one of the guilds to actually not attend the party and actually do the boss raid first. And the hope is that the betrayal of not attending the kind of unity party will be enough to basically put the two guilds at kind of war with each other, and eventually lead to some PKing. Because that's effectively what this movie is meant to be, and what they try to do is to really get into the idea of introducing the concept of player killers within a game of death. And, Kirito explains the concept and then describes them correctly so, as like, effectively in this game, treat them as being the serial killers of the real world. Because that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to get enjoyment out of killing people actually in the game. So we get a lot of the setup here. You get the scene towards the end with Pooh, Masago, Castles, whatever way you want to call him. Which is a quite nice setup, the whole it's showtime bit, so if you know that, you know who it is. So very, very kind of like significant stuff here. But what I will say about this movie, it ends extraordinarily abruptly. Now, admittedly, I would say probably that the book does it as well, but because the book is an ongoing series, and eventually there's going to be, the next volume to cover the next floor, that's fine. But because we don't have a clue what's next, at least from where I am at, I don't know what's next. I don't think there has been a third progressive movie confirmed, because I don't think they're going to do floor 6. And I don't think they're going to do floor 7. I just, if they're going to skip over the other stuff, I can't see them doing these 2 floors. Just with whatever criteria they might seem to have, I don't think they're there within those books. So in my opinion, they're probably going to wait if they do another movie until we maybe see what floor 10 is, which I think is meant to be a very, very significant floor. But from what I can tell, Progressive Volume 8 is where the series has sort of like stopped for now. Kawahara has not been like focusing on Progressive that much. It seems to just happen in bursts where like it'll be a year or two and then boom, here's two Progressive volumes within like a couple of months of each other. And we need to make some progress here, and that's the kind of like struggle here, is that the new content probably isn't coming out as quick as it probably should be necessarily. Which I suppose leads to the Kirito Asuna stuff in this one. A lot of the stuff with like Asuna is like, okay, initially you have the thing, she's afraid of ghost type monsters. She has the big incident underground where she falls into a trap, is separated from Kirito in basically like the lower kind of dungeon catacomb area after she's scared by the ghost monster. And then down below, she basically has an encounter with a monster, drops her sword. The sword gets stolen by one of the thief, was it Sly Shrewsbury monster? And she feels like she's about to die. That she feels kind of helpless again because Kirito's not around, her powerful sword is gone. What can she do? But because she's been with Kirito, she's like, no, I can get through this. Use the game mechanics, use what I've learned to try and get it back. And cleverly, she uses the idea these thief monsters will try to steal dropped items from players. So she just throws an item onto the ground, waits for the monster to come back, and kills it with her speed. And she keeps doing this over and over again, but never finds the one that stole her sword. She eventually begins to move on through the dungeon. She finds one item on the ground, which is this piece of paper that's rolled up, establishing that a meeting is happening in just a few minutes nearby. She goes to it, and this is the early Laughing Coffin meeting. So she's like shocked that like, okay, these guys are talking about player killing and the player base killing each other, and she doesn't know what to do. But then one of them reveals that like, oh, I just killed this monster just a little bit ago, and look what dropped, and it's Asuna's rapier. And this is when Kirito arrives. And so Asuna's kind of like big moment showing her growth across the five floors is while Kirito is talking to them confidently and almost on the verge of fighting with them here, Asuna realizes that like, okay, how do I get my sword back and help Kirito? And so what she decides to do is, what's the combination of things that happen here? Yeah, she throws the crumpled up piece of paper next to them. The Sly Shrewsbury comes in, steals it, and a monster arriving on the scene shocks him just by itself. But then she just lets out like this, just as loud as she can, scream from nearby, which given that they're in a kind of quiet area underground having this secret meeting and then Kirito's just there. Everyone is stunned by this, and he's just there with the sword, and he like drops it. The Sly Shrewsbury steals the sword again. Asuna pops out, kills that Sly Shrewsbury, and in like a second has re-equipped her proper rapier. And it's just meant to be this really cool moment showing that, in a way, like that was a Kirito move, but Asuna did it like completely on her own there. And this is more or less enough to kind of turn the tables and force the Laughing Coffin members to retreat. So that's a very cool like early scene that I think works very, very nicely. Then you have the two duels that Asuna has in this one, which is with Argo in the bath, which is more of just a kind of fun duel. They kind of do the full Asuna PvP arc here? I wouldn't quite say they do. In the novel, they more emphasize the idea of Kirito wants her to do PvP training. She actually asks for it. She can't bring herself to fight against another player. In the bath duel with Argo, she realizes that there's a sort of a different skill set to it, that it can be interesting by itself, and so she focuses on that a little bit more. In the movie, they more go with the idea that, I suppose, through that duel with Argo in the bath, and then the duel with Mito, that's where she kind of learns, and then in the background, I guess, Kirito teaches her. It's not too much of a change. I don't mind the difference between the two scenes like that much here. This is like actually like reasonably well done. in terms of like the boss battle itself, like the Vacant Colossus is actually a pretty cool boss. They reveal the entire room is the boss, and there's these kind of lines on the floor. If you touch the lines, basically a giant foot or hand will come out of either the floor or the ground to try and crush you. But you have to hit the lines to do damage. Then there's like a switch up, and its head comes down. There's a weak spot to do a significant amount of damage. The weak spot's also required to fully like unlock the hands if someone gets caught in it. Like it's a lengthy boss scene, and it's quite well done as one of the really big early significant boss battles. I've already touched on a few of the scenes that actually happen. And your usual kind of things happen here, where again it's a combination of Kirito and Asuna who get like the final blow on the boss. Mito is actually the one who gets the guild flag in this case, whereas was it Hafner, I think, who got it in the light novel, but they hand it over to Kirito. That's why he has the flag as the two guilds show up, and he explains the plan to them. This actually leads to a really nice scene, which is that Kibao is completely okay with this. Yeah, because it's Kibao that shows up, not the other guild as well. Kibao is okay with this, but the other members of the ALS start kind of grumbling and complaining about Kirito, that this deal is really unfair, we should just get the flag. And Asuna gets very upset about this because she has been beside Kirito, like helping form this plan to prevent the player base from completely fracturing. She gets why he did the whole beater thing on the first floor. And the fact that like very few other players seem to understand what he did, and in a way what role Kirito is playing in the overall kind of group here, in terms of he's participating in every single boss floor battle despite not being part of a guild, and is trying to be as fair as possible to both of them. And he's still getting accused of like stealing things and like keeping information from people and being like unfair. And it's the basically, like let me cry for you scene effectively, where she just sees the effort that he puts in and no one like appreciates him, and he tries to remain strong, but she has the moment where she actually just sort of like holds him and is like, if no one else will give you praise, I will give you praise. And it's a very, very nice scene to just show that like Asuna gets what Kirito has been doing. Completely does get it and the significance of what he's trying to accomplish on his own. And, it's an emotional scene. I think it worked really well. The voice acting performances were fantastic in this scene. Where we leave off, I suppose, with Mito is that she basically just decides that like I need to find that this revelation has meant that rather than just traveling around on her own, she now realizes I need to find what my purpose is in this game. And it's not that they immediately commit to she's going to open an item shop. That was just like an idea set forth before. So I don't know. But Mito, I guess, is going to appear in future content at some point because we don't know what happens to her. Which, I don't know. Will at some point in the light novels, like as we go forward, like will she be introduced into them in like volume 10 as having done stuff from before? And that's the problem. That is the entire problem with this when it comes to the whole Mito stuff, is that to keep the continuity of these books, they can't say that the stuff that happened in the movies happened, because it didn't happen that way. So they either just have to introduce Mito in the novels as having not really done much on the first couple of floors and only starts doing stuff from her introduction book onwards, and just say that like the movies are like a different version of the story, and it gets into the whole continuity thing that just seems like Kawahara or whatever Sword Art Online production committee doesn't particularly care about that stuff. I don't really know what to make of it myself. But again, it's the contrast for me with, as a Sword Art Online fan, I loved every minute of this. As a fan of the novels and just viewing this as an adaptation, I had some problems with it. But overall, I still really, really enjoyed it. Quite a lot. And I wish that more cinemas here showed it, so I didn't have to kind of trek into like town and stuff like that to go to like the one showing that's on in a day. If it was on at like my local cinema, like I'd probably go to see it again like tonight or something like that. That's how much I did actually still enjoy it. I will buy it on Blu-ray whenever it comes out. Again, not even the first movies come out on Blu-ray yet in the UK and Ireland, so waiting for that. That's where I'm at with this. I'm just kind of like, okay, where is SAO now currently? Because, okay, You're Not a Ring is still coming out. In terms of the English releases, I think we know that, like, 26 is coming out in March, and I'll review that when it comes out. There's other volumes that will come out, but I don't know what the status of like Progressive is. Like, I don't know when Volume 9 is going to hit. I'm not sure about what the idea for potentially the next animation project is. And given that this is like the 10-year anniversary, you'd think they'd maybe be announcing more stuff. And this is just a case of like, I'm almost like, did they announce anything? Am I just forgetting it? I'm not sure, but either way, it hasn't been as clear what the next path is as we knew there was a second Progressive movie after the first one, like straight away. So, they're my thoughts on the movie. Again, this was more of a kind of analysis of it based on the idea of it being an adaptation. If you haven't read the light novel, I'm sure you'll completely enjoy this, and again, probably not have too many problems, outside of maybe wondering what happened on the previous floors. At which point, read the light novels is probably the explanation, and find some way to, link all the different book anime continuities together. So there's my thoughts. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the movie if you saw it, as well as what I had to say about it. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.